It's nice to have you all here. We're short on time, so I'll be just hopping off and leave it all to you. You're alone now with all you guys. Thank you.
And good morning to all of you. I mean, isn't it like, at these events, which are so crowded, from time to time you need a little bit of privacy, don't you? We're going to discuss privacy today. In the next 30 minutes, I mean, that's really going to be a challenge. And I want to invite the two other panelists to the podium in a moment. But I'd like to briefly set the scene for this talk, because we want to discuss cultural differences when it comes to privacy regimes. And I think that, this can be illustrated perhaps by, a couple of brief themes. In Europe, we perceive privacy as a fundamental right that everybody has. And that doesn't exist in the US, for example. In the US, it's not like there's no privacy, but you have laws that grant privacy for certain sectors. Like if children go online, then there's a privacy law for that. But there's this overall scheme where you have privacy and the right to your data as a fundamental right. Also, Europeans tend to trust public authorities more in protecting their data than companies, whilst in the US, folks tend to trust companies more than they do public institutions. Now, so the two differences, let's stick with the US versus Europe, are very, very different. And many years back, the lawmakers said that they wanted to make it easy for data to travel transatlantic, so they came up with the idea of safe harbor. Just give me a show of hands of those who have heard of safe harbor. Okay, well, that's a couple. So this cultural gap between the two systems should be mitigated by using the safe harbor principles. And then this Austrian law student, Max Schrems, he thought that Facebook wasn't treating his data as they should, so he took Facebook to court, and that actually led to the invalidation of safe harbor at the European Court of Justice. And then, since the lawmakers on both sides of the Atlantic wanted the data to be able to travel, they rushed and came up with something like that's called Privacy Shield. Who of you have heard Privacy Shield? Okay, that's good. Now, the issue with Privacy Shield is that there are still a lot of people who say, well, Privacy Shield doesn't meet European standards either. So it may well be that Privacy Shield is only a cliffhanger until that is going to be invalidated. And then the subsequent solution might be invalidated as well, because these systems are so different. But then GDPR kicked in, the General Data Protection Regulation, and that came up with topics such as privacy by default, privacy by design, the right to be forgotten, the right to data portability, the right to get access to your own data. And you needed to do a lot of things as companies to be compliant. And some of the US folks might have said, well, the Germans and the Europeans, they're just a little bit crazy about this. But GDPR requires them to be compliant as well if they process the data of European data subjects. So US companies and companies all around the world are forced to deal with GDPR if they have a customer base in Europe, if they collect IP addresses of website visitors from European data subjects. And now that forces everybody to look over the fence and say, okay, what do I have to do? And today we want to discuss the impact of that and whether there is actually a cultural change in the making, because non-European companies are forced to look at European data protection laws as well. And for this discussion, I'm happy to invite two distinguished gentlemen to the podium that will share their insights with you. I'd like to invite Ridley Ruth to the stage. Ridley is COO with Dropsuite, and Christian Dawson, who thankfully stepped in for David Snead, who can't be with us today for personal reasons, but they're both with the Internet Infrastructure Coalition, and I'm sure that Christian, with whom I've shared the podium many, many times, will have a lot of insights to share with you guys. Now, I tried to set the scene a little bit, by illustrating how crazy the European data protection regulation is and what the challenge is for US companies in particular that have to deal with it. So Ridley, how did Dropsuite's customers react to the introduction of GDPR?
So I think, first of all, I have to say that Dropsuite is a public company listed in Australia. Our PT entity is in Singapore. And what we did is we actually split the company. We created a Drop My Site Inc. entity, and I'm the CEO of that. entity, and we run all of our North and South American operations through that. But I think initially customers really didn't understand GDPR. There was a lot of gray area in the regulation. I had to deal with a lot of lawyers and people like that, and they were saying we don't really fully understand that. But I think that now that some of these articles are coming to fruition as far as the fines and penalties being levied, that a lot more people are understanding GDPR. And at Dropsuite, we actually really got out in front of it. So when we first heard about this, we created a task force internally to make sure that our own company was compliant. And then since we do email archiving and email backup, we decided to go ahead and what can we do to basically make it much easier for the customers to comply with these GDPR regulations. And that kind of comes back to the cultural change. Culturally, we basically believe we want to be easy to do business with. And I think a lot of Americans, when we saw this GDPR stuff, we're like, oh my gosh, this is like, it makes it so difficult to do business in Europe. But like I'm seeing, I think that the GDPR, some of these regulations and everything, I'm seeing this is going to be a global phenomenon.
Absolutely.
Great. So, Christian, what were the initial reactions of I2C's members when GDPR was in the making?
Well, so we have a bunch of different sizes of businesses at I2 Coalition. We have large global businesses, we've got small businesses, and some of those businesses are regional, some of them also try to have a global focus. When you're taking a look at some of the larger global businesses, there's a certain extent to which you have to acknowledge that a lot of what's in GDPR is not new. Right, a lot of it's been around for a long time, and the difference is the penalties, and it's the costs of enforcement, right? And so there was this, oh wow, we really need to take these things seriously, and there needs to be a cultural shift. The big difference was seeing the smaller companies saying, I don't really understand this, what do I need to do? And there it was a culture of trying to figure out how they could do a survey of all the different ways they use personal data throughout their organization and figure out ways in which they could map it to even just a small company, even just understanding how they were collecting data and how they were disseminating it was a difficult exercise for a lot of people to get around.
I mean, the experience that we had talking to a lot of companies was that they didn't at times even understand what data they were collecting and how they were processing it. So I think it's a healthy exercise to undergo to find out what you're doing and whether you need all the data that you're collecting excessively in many cases. But Ridley, maybe we can dig a little bit deeper on how you managed to address the challenge and what you did to respond to the GDPR challenges. I mean, let's not forget that companies that are outside the EU, they, from a legal point of view, they only have to treat European data subjects' data differently than for their other customers that might be subject to different regimes. So have you chosen to use one solution for all your customers, i.e. have you increase the privacy standards for your global customer base, or have you created two buckets, GDPR and then for other jurisdictions?
So I think one thing is education within your organization. You need to bring everybody in and really, make them understand exactly what is the data that you have, how you can process that data internally. What we've done is we've actually siloed all of the data. So, all of the data either is going to be in Frankfurt, Germany, or it's going to be in Dublin, Ireland, or it's going to be in the US, or Sao Paulo, Brazil, or Tokyo. So we have a system now where all this, so it's not just the data you collect and you're keeping, it's also what kind of data are you sending outside of your organization. Because, in doing this process, we realized, hey, if you're using some heat mapping software on our customers in Europe to see this, you're actually sending personal data information outside of the EU. So it really takes an audit over your entire company as far as like how you handle that. And I just wanted to say, I wanted to mention this point, that Americans and Europeans view data differently. I mean, Americans very much are like, oh, well, everybody, has my data. I mean, they easily turn it over to Facebook and all these companies. And I was talking to somebody at the NSA one time and, talking about what they're doing. And they actually said, Ridley, we don't even have to get this stuff. All we have to do is ask these companies for their data, because in a lot of cases they have more than we do. But as far as the mindset of how we view this, I was talking with Rafael Laguna from the CEO of Open Exchange. One time we had a long conversation about this, and he goes, yeah, Ridley, if you really get it, growing up in East Berlin, he said, what would happen is the government would get this information, and what would happen, your uncle would say something, and then, your nephew or something wouldn't get a job. And it wasn't just about right now. It's about like what's going to happen in 10 or 15 years down the road as far as their viewpoint. So how we've dealt with that is we've basically siloed everything, done an audit. We have trainings within our company. Anybody touching the data has to go through a rigorous, training exercise. And it's a continual thing. It's not just a one-time thing. The important thing is that you're constantly coming up with new trainings and to educate your employees.
I wanted to make one point real quick. I would love to, at some point soon, get into my thoughts on how the U.S. views privacy writ large. But first, I want to make a point based on your notes around siloing things. One thing is that I think the companies in this room, the companies who'd have to deal with GDPR, they need to make a decision as to how they're going to manage it. And some people are looking to just sort of up-level things. Microsoft was, I think, the first company to come out there and say very early on, as soon as GDPR passed, that they're going to make GDPR the law of the land globally for them. And a lot of companies have followed suit. These are complex business decisions that you need to make depending on the line of your business you're in and how you use data. But there are lots of different ways to approach it.
Mm. Yeah, I think, Ridley, I just wanted to build on one of the points that you mentioned, and I think that's true for GDPR in particular. I mean, the privacy laws we had earlier, there was this thing, the record of processing activities, where you have to describe what data you're processing, what the legal basis for that processing is, with whom you share that data, how long you retain it, and you look at that for every process that you have in your business. And under the old regime, a lot of companies didn't bother at all because there were no sanctions. And those who bothered, they did this as a one-off exercise, and then it was put somewhere in the drawer, and it never saw the light of day anymore. And, so with GDPR kicking in, now you have the additional requirement of a data security management system. If you search GDPR for that word, you won't find it in there because it's not expressly mentioned, but GDPR assumes you to have mechanisms in place to keep your documents up to date, to make sure that new staff is trained on privacy, to make sure that you have processes or policies in place that allow for you to change the documents as you introduce new products, as you merge with other companies, and whatever challenges you might meet. But having said that, knowing that we will be forced to look at that for eternity, basically, do you think that your customers are accepting more and more what you're doing, or is there even a demand by those that are not subject to GDPR that they're choosing the GDPR compliant product?
Well, I think right now, and initially, they didn't know what to do. So when you don't know what to do, it's easy to do nothing. So I think until we, come out and we create tools and better education processes and everything that will help them better understand that. A lot of these guys are doing nothing. But at 4% of revenue or 20 million euros, whichever is greater, for fines, and I think now we're just starting to see some of those levied. So I think the customers are going to understand this and become much more important. It's going to become much more important to them. And I think even companies, even the big hosting companies, haven't really taken this, on as well. Now Strato, we just actually launched Strato with our email archiving product 2 days ago. And so I think they understand, they see the problem, and they're trying to solve it. And I think that if we can easily show these guys at an affordable price that they can solve these things, that we're going to see more and more greater adoption. But you touched on a point. that of retention, like keeping the data, right to be forgotten, Article 17.1. It's like there's still gray areas. There's still confusion. Like right now, the German tax laws are saying, hey, you have to keep this data, but GDPR is doing that. So what trumps this? And all the countries have different, financial and all these different things. So it's so we're working through this with the legal teams of Strato, and we don't want to really get in between this because it's really there. But if we can give them the tools that they can easily go in there, right to be forgotten, search all their data, go ahead and mark it, and then you created an immutable audit log to it because you have to, show that audit log. So I think that with this, you're going to see more and more adoption of people complying with GDPR.
I guess that's a great point. I've seen a lot of software products that don't even have the capability of deleting data. So you can't even implement a retention policy even if you had one. Yeah. Many companies don't. Christian, what do you see with your membership base? Do they get up to speed with GDPR? Is there still pushback on looking into it?
So it's a business risk calculation for everybody. Yes, many of the companies who are our members have gone through extensive education, who have done development in order to make sure that they are properly GDPR compliant. But a lot of it does depend on whether you believe yourself to be a likely target, right? And part of, I think, the assessment is that you need to make sure that you're doing enough to show that you are putting in a best effort. There's a certain extent to which a lot of this is up to interpretation of law. We'll end up probably getting sorted out by courts over time. And how much re-architecting of your systems you should take on beyond just simply doing sort of an acknowledged best effort with your current systems is something that people are making a case-by-case decision on.
Yeah, but the good thing is that GDPR has 2 levels of sanctions. We have up to 4% and 20 million, or up to 2% or 10 million.
Okay.
And if you fail, for example, to appoint a GDPR representative, that's only one of the minor breaches that's worth 10 millions.
Well, sure. But, like I said, we are small business advocates, and this industry is mostly driven by small business. And so when you say the good thing about these, I don't
that was a
consider it that
I know that humor doesn't translate, but that was a tongue-in-cheek remark that I made.
Okay.
But Christian,
Yeah.
It's interestingly, we've seen a couple of initiatives in the US
Sure.
that actually privacy laws should be implemented that equal the standards of GDPR. And in other jurisdictions, we've seen some that even go beyond that. So, whilst I think at the global level, you are likely to be compliant if you're GDPR compliant, because that's sort of the highest standard. Tell us a little bit about these initiatives at the state level as well as at the federal level.
Sure, absolutely. Honestly, I think that this is one of the most fertile times we've ever had for interest in privacy legislation in the United States. You're right when you framed it at the beginning that there has been this sort of historic notion that the U.S. cares about privacy when it comes to your privacy from your government, but not when it comes to privacy from businesses. There's almost been sort of a free market approach to data, right? Let's let the free market control how they manage our data, which is, we can get into a lot of the psychosis around that. I don't know. But the fact is that the past couple of years, first of all, GDPR, but also the stuff that's happened with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook has really sort of called people's attention to the necessity of reapproaching how we handle Facebook from a consumer level. And so all of a sudden, there is interest in the US in dealing with this in a similar way to how the EU deals with it. And there are, I think, right now 7 draft bills at a federal level that are exploring ways to deal with privacy at a federal level. California passed a comprehensive privacy bill that actually has a much broader definition of personal data than the one used in GDPR. I'm not saying that it is the same, it is similar to GDPR in many other ways, but you're right, it does go even further. We've also got NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology, which had a very successful framework built for how to deal with cybersecurity. And they're now focusing their attention on a privacy framework that will give companies, enterprises, a guide for how to deal with privacy by design. And that's in the process right now, and it's actually, I think, a really good collaborative process with industry. So we've got really good things happening right now. Now, let's say that there are a couple of things that we need to be concerned about when it comes to dealing with the legislative part that make me maybe not as incredibly optimistic as I otherwise would be. One is there's going to be a lot of fights as to who gets to be the regulator in this situation. The natural regulator would be the FTC in the United States, and there's going to be a lot of pushback of giving the FTC the power to regulate these companies and to fund it enough to actually do the things that it would necessarily do with a strong federal law. The other thing that we're going to need to deal with that's going to be difficult is the idea of whether a federal law would be able to supersede local laws. Right now, the head of, the Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi, and she's from California. California tends to be a leader when it comes to sort of progressive legislation. And she's probably not going to be too keen to say, hey, yes, go ahead and have a federal law that's going to supersede our even better privacy law that we built in, from her perspective, even better privacy law that we built in California. So those are things that are going to be tricky. But we care. That's the point. I am in the unenviable position of sitting here in Europe and defending the U.S.'s perspectives on privacy.
Well, that's good to hear. I mean, some folks that I know are sitting in the audience have expected us to have a decent fist fight on stage, but we will preserve civility. So don't you be afraid. In fact, we have a couple of minutes left on this panel, and I just wanted to give you the opportunity to chime in with your comments or questions that you might have. So we actually have a roaming microphone. So if you have a question or two, please feel free to raise your hand. There's a gentleman in the front row here. Would you be as kind as to introduce yourself and your affiliation?
Yeah, well, I'm Marcel van Bergelen. My affiliation is multiple, but I also work for a company which calls itself Privacy Factory. And there we actually train people in as data protection officer, those kind of stuff. I think, I don't know how you look at it, but in order to get privacy right, I think we need to look different at how the way how we handle data. Right now, I don't think there is any legacy or even any modern system out there which really can comply to the GDPR in all the forms it's written right now. I think there is also a massive opportunity there for the industry at large, but I don't see it really growing. There has to be something to start this up at a larger scale, I guess. And how are we collectively, how are we going to do that?
Do you have any ideas as to how this could be started before we go to the panel?
There are some ideas, I think.
Share one.
Well, maybe better cooperation between parties which are involved in this whole privacy stuff. Also, we should make companies more aware if they implement new systems, how they can do it right. Obviously, right now, nobody really knows how to do it right in all the facets because GDPR is still a little bit of a moving target, but there needs to be more cooperation on how am I going to handle data, how am I going to store it, and how will I implement systems in the future. I don't have all the answers right here, but I think it will be in better cooperation and in motivating the industry to actually show that there is a lot of there's a lot of money there actually. Yeah. A lot of systems need to be redone completely, and this will not happen within a year, maybe not even within 10 years. But there is a lot of money to be made there. And actually, eventually, you will be forced by governments with big fines to do so.
Any thoughts from the panel?
I completely agree with you. There's a massive opportunity right now. And just like I said before, people don't know what to do, so they're doing nothing. But I think as soon as you start seeing more and more of these fines being levied, as soon as you, Article 31 basically is, dealing with GDPR regulators, seeing how you're going to do. Once they start enforcing some of these things, then I think you're going to see more and more people go, okay, and it comes down to it, if you're a big organization, what's the cost of becoming GDPR compliant and what's the cost of the fine? If the cost of the fine is less than the cost of becoming GDPR compliant, then you'll just go ahead and take the fine. But I agree with you. I think the more that we all talk together and we discuss, how we can do this, then it's really about education.
I want to put this in terms of what we were talking about before about the possibility of U.S. legislation, because the U.S. is the other really big market other than the EU. We're probably the two biggest markets out there, and the ones that are most capable of levying fines and forcing systems to be built to be more privacy aware. I think that as sort of these big global companies re-architect their systems to be GDPR compliant, and many of them already are in the process of doing that. A lot of those tools that they have are fundamental technologies that some of the smaller businesses use already. So, you get to a point where the U.S. is taking a look at the possibility of implementing laws. They've always taken this free market approach. Well, a lot of these big companies that used to whisper in their ear saying, hey, we can't afford it, now we're going to say, well, we already did it. So go ahead and implement that process, do the fines. Some of those technologies get used, and it furthers us down the path. And you're right, it's going to take a long time.
And I'd like to add to that. I think we need a cultural change in the business people. Historically, as storage became more and more affordable, people would just collect wherever they could collect and keep that data because they might be able to make use of it at some point. But and also, you always had budget positions for data security and security as such separate from the other budgets. So the folks that were interested in security always needed to find money to do that. So I think what we need is actually a change of thinking or paradigm shift so that data security and privacy is baked into all the entrepreneurial thinking. Because what you see today, yes, you can make a business decision and say the fines are lower cost than what I would have to pay to restructure my systems. Right. But let's put the reputational risk into the equation as well, because now with the requirement to notify the authorities, with the requirement for certain breaches to notify the aggrieved data subjects, you get more publicity with the breach than you want to. So I think that as we move on, and you see that with startups, at least a lot of people that I talk to, that they really build privacy, build data security into all their business processes, while other companies see it as an add-on, as an unwanted add-on.
I agree with you to an extent, but we also need to make sure that the laws that get implemented are nimble enough to realize that there are different reasons why we collect data. If I want to sell you something and you need to give me credit card information, I have a responsibility to keep that information secure, but it's different than if my business is centered around monetizing your personal data. And I want to make sure that laws are nimble enough to understand that there's different reasons that we hold data, and we should be held to different standards for different types of business.
Understood. Do we have more questions, or do we have a follow-up?
Maybe somebody else. Yeah, I have maybe a small follow-up on that one. You mentioned, there are different reasons why you maintain certain kind of data. And I think there's a lot of business, essentially, even in technical solutions for that. Because right now, an out-of-the-box database product, for example, doesn't give me the tools to store why I am, maybe to add metadata, like why am I storing this data? And maybe I could add tools like that this data, for example, self-destroys after a while because it's not necessary anymore. Obviously, you need to think about it. You also need to think about how am I going to replicate this to other systems? Standardizations of those kind of things. And there are thousands other things which there are no standards for example. Another thing, freedom of data. I can ask Facebook to give me all the data they have about me. What I get is a huge blob of essentially almost useless data right now, because I cannot simply import it somewhere else. You could make standardizations from there and say, okay, if this needs to be portable, etc., then let's try to standardize the data formats. We exchange those kind of things to make it really transportable, so I can get my data from a bank, an energy company, etc., maybe, and also easily import it somewhere else.
Okay.
And
No,
some
yeah.
work is being done on that.
So
Some of the major platforms are working on that sort of portability.
I
Yes,
suggest that you can respond to that in your final statements, because we have 1 minute and 30 to go.
Sure.
So let's just assume we meet here again in 5 or 10 years when the lords of uptime have matured to the grandfathers of uptime. And will we see more standardization? Will we see the US and Europe having grown together more? What's your outlook for the years to come? Ridley, go first.
Yes, I believe completely that you're going to see that. And what you were talking about, Article 17-1, we have made it so easy to go ahead and, any customer of ours can basically download, to a PDF zip file and get their information. But you're right, there's a huge opportunity for lots of companies to go ahead and do the same thing. But I'm seeing that the shift toward privacy is going global. We see it in Australia, we're seeing it in the US, and I think it's a good thing.
Christian, last words.
The U.S. is making they are focusing on privacy. They're going to come up with some sort of a framework. I don't know what it's going to look like. It won't look just like GDPR. Almost on purpose, it won't look like GDPR. But we do care about Privacy Shield or whatever else is going to replace Privacy Shield. There needs to be a way for us to continue to communicate, so that will happen. The entire privacy ecosystem will be up-leveled in the process.
Thanks so much. And I think this is a crucial point in time. We are, as catalysts in this industry, we can help make a more fundamental cultural change happen. I mean, data is the new oil. Let's treat it with proper respect and be prosperous with it.
Exactly.
Thanks so much, Ridley. Thanks so much, Christian. And I yield the microphone to our moderator.
Thank you, Thomas.
Okay, thanks guys.